Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello and welcome to Reimagining Motion, a podcast from the High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, which is undertaking research into the complex and interrelated issues of sustainable transport across Africa and South Asia. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. I'm Holger Dulkman, your host for today's session. Welcome. Successfully moving people and goods around a country is at the heart of economic and social progress. But for many people throughout sub-Saharan Africa, it remains a struggle to access health services, education and work due to long distances and limited transportation options. Out of necessity, active mobility, such as walking and cycling, is the main mode of transport for most Africans, especially in rural communities. More than 70% of sub-Saharan Africans' rural residents must cover long distances without access to roads or transportation to get to work, transport goods to market, travel to school, or reach medical care. Yet walking and cycling is often overlooked when considering planning infrastructure by both policymakers and practitioners. There's still a tendency to assume infrastructure development lies with motorized vehicles, particularly the car, though in low-middle income countries it is a minority who owns cars. Therefore, besides informal and formal public transport, low-emission modes of transport like walking and cycling infrastructure could offer a much-needed intervention for the environment and improving access to education, health, services and jobs. In this episode of Reimagining Motion, we will explore the opportunity and the challenges of developing future infrastructures with active mobility as a central mode of transport. I'm delighted to be talking to Gail Jennings, a research consultant based in South Africa, who has done a lot of work into walking, cycling and user needs and strategies for shifting travel behavior to more sustainable modes and patterns. In recent years, she had worked in 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa to understand the bicycle market system and walking and cycling behaviors in rural and peri-urban areas in Africa. Particular of interest in her work has been the impact of mobility poverty in these areas and on gender constraints to increase mobility. Welcome, Gail. Good to see you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to this conversation very much.
Fantastic. So let's dive immediately into our podcast. Perhaps we could start with a better understanding of the extent to which walking and cycling is an important mode of transport in middle and low-income countries, with a focus on African cities.
As you mentioned in the introduction, walking and cycling are possibly your main modes, and what I call it more is your main primary modes, because what we've discovered is that at some point 70% of trips in African cities and rural areas are made by walking. But they are not the only ways in which people move. So people who walk will also cycle, will also take other modes of transport, but these are the main ways in which people travel, by walking, and to a lesser extent cycling, but walking is the primary mode.
Thanks for that. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the challenges that people facing to walk, to cycle in rural communities as well as in cities?
We've given the statistics in the beginning of the podcast about how at times up to 70% of trips are made by walking in African cities. And that on sort of first hearing can sound like this is a positive thing, that the mode shares are around sustainable modes, and that walking, that kind of mode split is something that would be enviable for people working in European cities, for example. But we're talking about people who are walking in very, very poor conditions in terms of infrastructure. Mostly there wouldn't be sidewalks for people to walk on. And if there are sidewalks, they are very poor quality, any manner of obstacles that make it very, very unpleasant to walk. So these cities might have very high walking shares, but this is not a joyful or pleasant way of moving. And one of the consequences of this is that people would very much rather be taking motorized modes of transport. But it's always talked about when it comes to African cities that one of the main challenges is not to attract more people to walk, but to retain the mode split that exists already. Because cities are highly, highly motorized now, congested, very poor air quality, So retaining the walking share is really important, but it's a challenge because people who currently walk are doing so in these very unpleasant circumstances. And unless walking is made to be a very much more pleasant and desirable way of getting around, then retaining these mode shares is just not going to happen. And that's just about the urban situation. In the rural areas, it's really quite different. So you get similar, very high mode shares of walking in the rural areas, but this is different to the cities in that people are walking possibly in better conditions because they will be walking on roads or walking through fields on walkways. They are not subjected to as much dangers in terms of road safety, personal security.
Thanks for framing us as some of the key challenges people are facing in cities versus the rural community. So, and this podcast is about future sustainable infrastructure. So when we talk also about your work you've done in many places or in Africa, what's your experience? What are the key challenges for active mobility gaining ground as an integral element of countries' infrastructure?
There's been an increasing number of African cities or African countries that have now got walking or NMT, as we call it. We tend to still call it that in Africa, non-motorized transport. I know there's a move to refer to it as active mobility, but that's something that we can actually also talk about later in the podcast. So very many more countries now have got non-motorized transport policies. And so this is becoming recognized as a mode of transport, walking and cycling. But when it comes to commitments to building infrastructure to facilitate walking and cycling, that's a different matter, because in countries that have very low resources in terms of building infrastructure, it's not that easy to allocate resources to something that is still seen to some extent as a marginal mode, even though, as we've just been talking about, it is a majority mode. But to some extent, it's seen as a mode of transport that we should be moving away from. It's still seen as something that signs of possible development are that people are taking motorized transport or driving. So to allocate infrastructure to people walking can seem to some extent like a failure. You know, we are having to still build infrastructure for people who walk, when we should surely be, as an emerging economy, we should be building infrastructure for people who drive or use motorized transport. So there's an element of kind of cognitive dissonance in that sense, is that people see these very high mode shares, but there's an inclination to try and move into what is seen as being examples of greater development, which is a motorized environment.
So you mentioned two challenges. One is a finance one, and the other is really about decision makers not seeing still as a transport or walking infrastructure as a part of a future vision as a how cities are. So you mentioned also some national policies are in place. Is there a good example where some national policies already get into the implementation?
Yes, at the moment, Rwanda has policies where they commit to allocating a certain proportion of the transport budget to building walking and cycling infrastructure. But the challenges around financing are real when it comes to building infrastructure. So this is not necessarily an excuse where people or governments commit to building infrastructure and then kind of just don't or decide to spend the financing on something else. These are even where we do see commitments. And in Zambia, there are also clear commitments to developing infrastructure. And in Ethiopia too, as you mentioned, Kenya too. Those policies all allocate, I think in Nairobi, it's something like 20% of the transport budget has been allocated to building walking and cycling infrastructure. I would need to confirm if that is the exact percentage. But when you are living in circumstances where there are so many unmet needs, where people might need more amenities, hospitals, housing, schools, it can be a real challenge to find the budget to build walking and cycling infrastructure. Particularly, as we were talking about earlier, it is still, even though there is increased policy acceptance of walking and cycling as a mode, there is still some level of reluctance to accept that this is a mode that is here to stay. And to elaborate on the development of roads, again, we're talking about situations where roads are very poor quality or might be unsealed or gravel roads. So there's a real tension between what is going to be best for the economy. So again, when we talk about political will, it can sometimes seem a very straightforward discussion, like there's no political will to build walking and cycling infrastructure. But when you're looking in circumstances where distances are long, and good quality roads make it much easier for people to access schools, education, higher education, health, amenities that are really important, having good quality roads is essential. So it's a problem where it is important that motorized public transport is better, that roads are better to enable increased access. It's not always as straightforward but these roads have been built instead of walking and cycling facilities, if that makes sense. It's never that binary.
Where's the main difference in terms when it comes to infrastructure and infrastructure policies and planning?
Most of the transport policies and walking and cycling policies that we've been talking about are very much focused on urban areas. So walking and cycling in the policies is seen as being congestion mitigation and air quality mitigation primarily, and a road safety intervention. So road safety is a big issue in the cities and in the rural areas, where sometimes about 40% of road deaths are pedestrians, and there's a big push to build infrastructure to make roads safer for pedestrians. But you will find, as I was saying earlier, the circumstances in rural and urban are so different that it would seem that we would need to encourage rural walking and cycling policies and urban walking and cycling policies. They really are very different. And what you find in rural areas is that people are walking in much less onerous conditions. In that sense, they might be walking longer distances, but in work that we conducted in 6 countries in Africa last year, we were trying to understand what the challenges are for people walking, and issues around road safety and personal safety were very seldom mentioned. So these would be among the first challenges that people walking in urban areas would talk about. They would be afraid of being mugged or attacked on the way. They would be anxious about road safety. But in the rural areas, people don't talk about this. They talk about the challenges of having to walk in the rain, having to walk through rivers, walking quite long distances and carrying loads. So you will find people might have to walk to market, or walk carrying children, or walk accompanying children. So the challenges are very much more around fatigue and around detours and around load bearing rather than personal and road safety.
So what are the consequences out of versus this observations? What does it mean for the infrastructure there?
So if we look in urban areas, there is absolutely a case for infrastructure. I mean, there's no doubt. Good quality sidewalks would make all the difference. People would be much more inclined to walk, or people would enjoy walking. There wouldn't be as much of an urgency to shift to motorized transport. In rural areas, when your challenges are things like distance or load carrying, infrastructure is not necessarily going to mitigate that. We looked at how do people move in these rural areas in Malawi and in Kenya, and what kind of distances do people walk? What do they do when the distances are too far to walk? And what we found is that there's a very, very multimodal thing going on. People we think about people walking as their primary mode, but it's very much that people walk as it's the most common way in which they move. But sometimes, when I think about it as a main mode, if people are going to travel longer distances, they don't walk. But if distances are longer than about 4 or 5 Ks, they will take a bicycle if they have one. And that's another whole discussion that we can have. Otherwise, they will take public transport if distances are too far. And if they cannot afford public transport, then the challenge is that they simply don't make those trips. So we are looking at one of the consequences of the distances being far, that people are living with the consequences of mobility poverty, which just means that they might not get to hospital when they need to. They wouldn't be able to visit family when they need to. Their children don't get to go to the schools that they need to go to. They don't get to market in time to sell their produce or buy the best produce. So the kind of challenges that distance and inaccess brings will not be overcome by better walking and cycling infrastructure. But if we look at a bicycle as an example of infrastructure, then bicycles are a hugely important intervention. So while building bike lanes or building sidewalks won't necessarily make a difference, enabling people to have access to this kind of intermediate mode of transport of a bicycle would make a substantial difference to people's livelihoods and mobility.
My impression was also that in comparison to other places around the world, in Latin America, I think Bogota was also like the glancing example with also 150 kilometers of pop-up bike lanes. And so providing also separate infrastructure, which provided us then more road space and moved also road space away also from cars, and people just used it because of some restriction also to public transport. But I recall there was not much happening in Africa. Is that correct?
Yes, there was. Our research was trying to, in the beginning of COVID, we thought, let us try and see where the best pop-up infrastructure should be, and then try and motivate to have it. So we started out by sort of having an activist agenda in that research, thinking, okay, so these are the routes that people take. This is where pop-up infrastructure should take place. And during the course of that research, a lot of the restrictions started to be removed, and we shifted to trying to understand why was it that in these cities there was very little around pop-up infrastructure compared to, as you were talking about. And it seems that, again, where a lot of the pop-up infrastructure that you were talking about was bicycle infrastructure. And in the African cities that we've been talking about, there's a very, very low bicycle mode share. So we've been talking about the very high walking mode shares. In rural areas, there's a much higher bicycle mode share, but cycling is not such a significant mode. So it just wasn't going to be a priority when people are concerned with access to food, access to livelihoods, when people's the economic decline was so rapid that what would be seen as a kind of a middle class intervention was not going to get traction.
Slightly changing the subject. So far, we have talking more or less. It's very general about this people walking and cycling, but we know so that there is a strong gender perspective. So women travel different. So there are more trips. There's less access to individual vehicles. Challenges for public transportation. There are cultural barriers for women also to cycle in some places. And you work also with that perspective. So is there enough attention to a gender perspective when it comes to improving the situation for walking and cycling?
Well, when it comes to walking, what is interesting in African cities is that there's not a huge difference between the numbers of women and the numbers of men walking. So it's quite kind of gender equitable in that sense. You'll find as many women and as many men walk in the cities. But in rural areas, it's very different, because where women are very much more likely to walk than men. And this is to some extent to do with mobility of care, where it's women who will be taking children to schools or healthcare, or will be walking to the market. So it also has a lot to do with the ways in which people make a living. But when it comes to bicycle ownership, this is where we see this particular gender perspective, where if there is a vehicle that is owned, or if there is motorized transport that has to be paid for, then it will be more likely to be the men in the household who will have access to that mode. So you see this kind of gender inequity around ownership of a vehicle, or ownership of or access to the means by which to pay for motorized transport. There are not as many cultural constraints to women cycling as there used to be. So although we'll find in some of the areas women will talk about how they are not permitted to ride, or it's seen as being undignified or unhealthy for women to ride, women themselves don't buy into that. This was something that we found very interesting. So there's resentment and anger about this kind of cultural taboo on cycling. I mean, women are increasingly not having any of this. And in Uganda, we were interviewing focus groups of women who were saying that, this is absolutely, this is something that must be got rid of. So women want to ride. One of the big issues is that women are more likely to be living with low income than men. So it's not easy for women to buy a bicycle. So, but if women have a bicycle, they generally do know how to ride. And in Zambia, I was doing intercept surveys at a rural antenatal clinic, and almost all the women arrived on a bicycle. So instead of believing that women cannot cycle or don't want to cycle, work toward providing access to bicycles. So making it easier for women to buy bicycles, or having programs that focus on women having access to bicycles. So again, the organization that I did this work with, World Bicycle Relief, in their programs, they make sure that 70% of bicycles that are part of the distribution programs or purchase programs go to women farmers, women dairy workers, women healthcare workers. So, so that's fantastic. But often, you'll see women don't ride because they don't have a bicycle, but if they had a bicycle, they would.
What are ways to scale that? Because I don't think it's like a charity will be the only places to, or if only a charity also pays attention to that, is that sufficient also to scale which is needed?
So when you see the fantastic organizations that export secondhand bicycles to Africa, they're often from kind of urban European bicycles, which are not going to work. So, they do, but, they don't last for very long. And when you see the quality of some of the roads that people are traveling on, again, you will understand why it is important. And it's one of the reasons why people struggle to maintain their bicycles, is because the road quality is so poor that bicycles don't last. So they have to. People sometimes say they take their bicycles in for routine maintenance every month. So that's one of the challenges. And now we're talking about gravel roads. But then in these programs of roads maintenance and tarring the roads, it has an unexpected negative consequence in that people who cycle on the tarred roads, the surface is much better for maintenance of their bicycles, but the road speed for vehicles is now much faster. So now road safety becomes worse. So as soon as you've got a better road and people now have better motorized access to everything that people need access to, it has a negative impact on people who cycle.
So we've seen, and we could probably also do a double podcast around walking is different than cycling. And then also we have also the other dimension on cities versus rural. So if you try also to summarize as we're moving us towards the end of the podcast, what are the elements which really also needs to change? And let's start also with walking, differentiating between cities and rural.
In the urban areas, it's pretty straightforward in that walking infrastructure is so clearly the right intervention. And there is political will among people who are currently officials in many of the cities where these policies exist. There is sometimes quite a high turnover and therefore loss of institutional knowledge and commitment. So I would say that is an important element to ensure that people across the board know the value of walking and cycling, so that it isn't invested only in one champion in government or in a few champions, so that policies become very much more institutionalized. So, because that will mean that it is easier to allocate the resources to building walking infrastructure. So in cities, walking, and if you kind of sell walking, if I can use it that way, as an air quality intervention rather than a climate intervention, then it is much more likely to see traction in the development of infrastructure, and that is likely to get walking infrastructure in the cities. When it comes to rural areas, I would say that a very key intervention is to find a way, whoever the market actors might be, for high quality, sustainable bicycles to be more affordable. Because people use bicycles, they are able to carry very much more loads on bicycles and travel very much longer distances. But at the moment, the quality of the bicycles are not able to sustain or to last the kind of wear and tear, and load bearing is not that easy. But high quality bicycles are expensive. So possibly around things like reducing taxes on bicycle imports, programs that enable people to have access to loans to buy bicycles. I would say that is an important intervention, because people don't walk the kind of distances that sometimes we assume they do in rural areas. People walk 2-3 kilometers. They're not walking the very long distances that they need to travel. Those are being made on motorized modes. But a bicycle would mean that those longer distances can be made by a non-motorized, non-polluting, much cheaper mode.
Thank you, Gail. That's a great summary of the key messages there. But do you have any final words?
So, we tend to talk about how people walk very long distances, but they don't necessarily. People are multimodal. And we talk about people having to walk. When recent research that I did, people talk about choosing modes. They'd say, I chose to walk because I could afford to walk. But if I need to take my child to hospital, I choose to take a motorbike taxi. So people talk in terms of agency, decision-making, choice. There isn't this kind of blanket, choiceless, captive user who walks very long distances. So we need to interrogate those kind of standard narratives. We talk about people having to walk because there are no other modes available. In many instances, there are other modes. There are motorbike taxis, there's bicycle taxis, there's minibus taxis, but people can't afford them. So it's about affordability, not non-availability. So overall, the situation is very much more complex, more nuanced than we always think. But sometimes it's easier just to kind of talk about it in simplistic terms if we're wanting to get policy through. But I think it makes an impact to have more nuances.
Wonderful. So thanks, Gail, again, also for taking your time also for the podcast, and hopefully also we can continue on other subjects in the future with this podcast, and obviously in every other forum. So thanks a lot, Gail.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Holger. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to find out more about the work of our guests and any of the resources, please check out the links in the description. I also encourage you to listen to the other episodes in the series. Also, you can leave us a rating, hopefully a good one, and a review. It really helps others find our podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the work of High Volume Transport, you can check out our website at transport-links.com, or follow us on Twitter at transport_links, or on LinkedIn at High Volume Transport Applied Research. program. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The program's new body of research aims to help inform decisions of policymakers in low-income countries and make road and rail transport greener, safe, and more accessible and affordable. My name is Holger Dogman, and you have been listening to Reimagining Motion. Thank you. Stay and travel safe wherever you are. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.